Marxism in America. A greater threat to democracy than Iran or Russia? In the current political landscape, concerns about foreign interference, particularly from nations like Iran and Russia, have rightfully commanded the attention of the American public. Both countries have been accused of meddling in U.S. elections and promoting propaganda that weakens the democratic process. However, while foreign interference is undoubtedly a threat, there is a growing concern that the rise of Marxist ideologies within America poses an even more profound danger to democracy. This threat stems from those who advocate for sweeping societal changes while refusing to engage in the legislative process, a critical component of democratic governance. The role of Marxist ideology. Marxism, at its core, advocates for a class struggle that culminates in the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a classless society. While this may seem like a distant concept, elements of Marxist thought have increasingly found their way into American political discourse, especially on the far left. These ideologies challenge the foundations of democracy by promoting revolutionary change without regard for the legal and institutional framework that underpins the United States. One of the primary threats posed by Marxists who refuse to engage in the legislative process is the erosion of the rule of law. Instead of working within the system to bring about change through legal means, they advocate for bypassing the legislative process altogether. This refusal to participate in the legal framework that defines democracy weakens the very foundation of the republic and undermines the Constitution. Democracy depends on the legislative process. The democratic process is built upon the rule of law, where elected representatives debate, draft, and pass legislation that reflects the will of the people. Marxists who refuse to participate in this process, or who seek to undermine it through calls for revolution or anarchy, represent a direct threat to democracy. When they refuse to write laws or engage in legislative compromise, they are essentially advocating for governance through chaos rather than the orderly rule of law. This refusal to participate in democracy echoes authoritarian tendencies, where the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals or a radical group undermines the will of the people. Ironically, those who claim to fight for equality and justice through Marxist ideology often promote methods that would centralize power and strip away the freedoms they claim to support. Why internal threats are more dangerous. While Russia and Iran are foreign adversaries, they do not have the ability to directly alter the U.S. legal system or destroy democratic institutions from within. Foreign interference, while dangerous, can often be mitigated through security measures, sanctions, and international diplomacy. The threat posed by Marxists within the United States, however, is much more insidious because it comes from within the very fabric of the nation. Marxist-leaning politicians and activists, particularly those who refuse to write or support legislation, are undermining the democratic process from the inside. Their unwillingness to engage in the established system of governance means that they are effectively pushing for a breakdown of that system, creating an environment where lawlessness, rather than democratic decision-making, prevails. This internal sabotage of democracy, through the refusal to follow its rules and procedures, creates a vacuum of authority that can be exploited by authoritarian figures or radical movements. The fragility of democracy. America's democracy is not invincible. It relies on the active participation of its citizens and elected representatives to function properly. When individuals refuse to engage in the legislative process, they weaken the democratic structure and leave the country vulnerable to both internal and external threats. To maintain a healthy democracy, it is crucial for Americans to recognize that threats to democratic governance are not limited to foreign adversaries. The rise of radical ideologies, particularly Marxist-inspired movements that reject the rule of law and the legislative process, poses a greater threat to democracy than Iran or Russia could ever hope to achieve. The fight for America's future is not just against foreign enemies, but also against the erosion of democratic principles within its own borders. Conclusion. In sum, the refusal by certain Marxist-leaning factions in America to engage in the legislative process represents a more dangerous threat to democracy than the actions of Iran or Russia. While foreign powers may attempt to meddle in U.S. elections, the far more pressing danger lies in the erosion of democratic norms from within. It is imperative that Americans, regardless of political affiliation, recognize the value of the legislative process and reject any movement that seeks to bypass it in favor of radical and undemocratic alternatives. The preservation of American democracy depends on it.